our first speaker. I chose our first speaker because I had a few things in mind. I wanted a big, interesting, hot, upcoming company driven by a lot of data, and I wanted the person who understood that, person who personified that. Mark Pincus and Zynga absolutely fit that bill. And this points of control theme that we used last year, which you may recall, which sort of was when this map was built, is carrying over, as you know, this year. And of course, Zynga had a very interesting points of control negotiation with Facebook over using Facebook credits in the Zynga ecosystem. And of course, Zynga recently announced Project Z and sort of creating its own platform independent of any particular service that it might be dependent on. So I wanted to talk about that. And then the story of the last year really has been the story of Facebook and the rise of Facebook. I wanted someone who could discuss that, and I thought Mark Pincus could really talk about Facebook. And we do, of course, have the CTO of Facebook, Brett Taylor, helping us close the show on day 3. And lastly, I really wanted to talk to someone who was going through this sweet dream known as the IPO. This wonderful experience of getting ready for an IPO, and I knew that that would be a lot of fun to talk about with Mark Pincus. Unfortunately, citing his quiet period on Friday afternoon, Mark Pincus decided that he couldn't come. Now, that was disappointing to me, and I'm sure to you, but for some reason a month ago, his CFO and his lawyers and his bankers were cool with it, and then something happened on Friday or Thursday. I don't know what. Now, stop the speculating and the tweeting with the speculations. I really don't know. But I have been in this situation in past lives, and I understand how things can change, and it's all good because we found someone else who can come out here, who can speak to every one of these points, who's been through the negotiations with Facebook, who has been through the process of all of these IPOs, who can speak openly about all of it, who understands data-driven, who understands building a company that is leveraged off the Facebook platform more than once, and who has absolutely no lawyers or CFOs to tell him to stop saying whatever happens to come across his mind. And that man is Sean Parker. So please join me in welcoming Sean Parker to the stage. So Sean, it's very nice of you to come and take over for your friend Mark Pincus. I have to clarify that when I say Mark around you, yeah. You take that one, I'll take this one. I'm curious, how are you spending your days these days? What are you spending most of your time on?
Largely on airplanes. I mean, it's been pretty evenly divided these days between Spotify, which sends me halfway around the world to Stockholm, and Airtime, which is my new startup with Sean Fanning.
Oh, so we can call it Airtime now.
We can call it Airtime now. We can't talk about what the product does or will do, but we can talk about all the other sort of.
We can talk about the meaning of the word air and the meaning of the word
exactly.
time. And
as long as we don't get into any substance, then we're okay.
Oh, my goodness, this is going to be fun. So let's start with Spotify then, if we could.
Sure.
Now, Spotify was recently blessed at the Royal Court with a deep integration and a stage time at F8 as a sort of poster child of integration with the Open Graph at Facebook. What does that do for Spotify that it wouldn't otherwise have?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing is it gives Spotify access to, Facebook's, I don't know what the official number is now, but roughly 800 million users, and it enables music to go massively viral. So, Facebook has always been, the social graph, I should say, has always been a great promulgator of information. And that was kind of one of the things that was unique about Facebook relative to all of its predecessors, is that we didn't see it as this network of profiles. We saw it as a way of disseminating media, whether that media is created by individuals, social media, user-generated media, or whether it's music or movies. And you saw this with video from YouTube promulgating through the social graph virally. It's a huge accelerant on virality. But because of licensing issues, there was no way to enable that same kind of virality for music. So the dream with Spotify was to ultimately integrate Facebook and Spotify so that viral distribution of the social graph could be unlocked and that power could be brought to bear for the music industry.
Is having pole position essentially winning in the Facebook economy? In other words, if I were a developer thinking about doing a music, or if I were Tim, who is from Pandora, who's here tomorrow, am I like, damn, how'd they get that spot?
Well, I mean, we did launch as a neutral platform. Would have been nice if we'd launched solo as the only partner, but we did launch as a neutral platform with other partners like Rdio and Mog, and the terms are identical as far as I can tell.
So there's no favoritism being played?
Not that I can see.
There was word that you were arguing with Mark about some of these issues. Is that argument been resolved?
That story is amazing. I mean,
I'm not sure everyone knows what that story is, but there was a New York Post, which you have to take with about a shaker of salt
right.
at any given time. I'm sorry if there's anyone from the Post here, but sometimes you do.
You wouldn't invite those guys, would you?
No, the press is welcome at all times, everywhere. But there was a story about how you guys got into a heated discussion early in the morning hours about something or other related to the Spotify Facebook hookup.
So I love this story because it shows the potential for sort of one little minute, irrelevant, largely incorrect rumor to spark this enormous explosion in press, largely driven by social media. I end up generally being the victim of these platforms that I had something to do with creating.
I just think you were trying to write a sequel to that movie.
Yeah, it seemed that story seemed to go everywhere, and it was wrong on so many counts. I mean, it's just we weren't even at the place that we weren't even at the place they claimed we were at. They got the date wrong. They conflated many different events into one event. The truth is, Mark and I are always discussing these things, but we weren't like having a yelling match on Hollywood Boulevard.
Right. That's unfortunate. I'm sure it will make it into the script, though.
I look forward to that.
Let's talk about the music industry a
Yeah.
bit. You have a long and storied relationship with the music industry. I should say that when, over the weekend, this whole story developed with Mark Pincus being unable to be here, and I called Sean, and he was gracious enough to say he'd step in, he came up with this idea that he really wanted to bring a friend of his to interview him by the name of Scooter Braun, who's a very well-respected guy in the industry, young guy, seen as a...
He manages John Battel's favorite artist, Justin Bieber.
He manages my son's age artist. Literally, the guy is the age of my son. And Scooter was willing, literally, to hop on a plane from, I think they were in Chile or something.
Peru, yeah.
Yeah, and get up here to do this. But I think he thought better of it for reasons that are probably self-evident. I'm not sure.
You scared him off.
I scared him off.
Just kidding.
But when we were talking about Scooter coming, you said, he represents the face of the next music industry. Mm-hmm. What is that next music industry, and how does it relate to ours?
I think we're all trying to figure out what is that next music industry, and I think the guys in the record labels, not to demean their genius, but that are just as confused about it as the rest of us. Obviously, when there's a whole set of things that happen when you move to digital distribution, so the cost of each new copy goes to zero. So you end up with the potential for completely frictionless distribution of music. You don't have to make physical CDs and ship them somewhere and worry about breakage and manufacturing and all that stuff. So suddenly you have one of the primary limitations on the ability to release an unlimited number of artists per year goes away. Because in the physical world, there's limited shelf space, there's limited end cap space. There's only so many trucks, you can only make so many CDs. I mean, they ultimately it became pretty cheap, but there's still these physical limitations with retail. Then you look at the fact that the promotional mechanisms were extremely limited, in particular terrestrial radio. So there's only a limited number of radio stations per market, and that was the primary way that new music got injected into the system. Then you look at MTV. Even more limited than terrestrial radio. There was, in the beginning, when MTV actually played music videos, there was one MTV, not one MTV2 and all these, just one. And getting on MTV was make or break. The record labels hated MTV because it controlled their destiny. So now we're in this interesting world where, because of platforms like Spotify, where you can consume music and share music and build your collection without ever having bought the music, you can essentially sample on an unlimited basis. It costs nothing to make each additional copy of the music. And you find out about music primarily through your friends. All of these historic limitations that basically defined the dynamics of the record business no longer exist. So all of these various departments within record labels don't make a lot of sense anymore. So the traditional sort of A&R function was like going out to like dirty, sawdust floor nightclub, listening to some band, developing them, signing them, and then you bring in a great producer. That cost a fortune. Now the cost of production is down as well with digital and Pro Tools in everybody's bedrooms. So you spent a bunch of money making it, and then you had to spend a bunch of money with indie promoters who were basically crooks promoting the music on radio. And then maybe you got on MTV, and all of this was very expensive, and it was all sort of centralized under the management of...
Extremely slow.
...of the record label. It was, there's a sense in which it was slow, but a sense in which it also was much faster. Lucian Grange, the CEO of Universal, once described it to me as a rubber band. He said you pull the rubber band way back, and then it takes a while to pull the rubber band back, but when you let it go, it goes, and it goes fast. And so you could take an artist from 0 to number 1 pretty reliably with a high degree of predictability, and you could do it over and over. Now it takes a while, and a great example is a little band you might have heard of called Foster the People. Their record came out, I think, over a year ago, and they spent about 8 months. I'm not sure what the record was doing for 8 months, but it was gradually sort of building steam on Spotify and on iTunes, and all of a sudden in the last, I'd say, 3 months, this band just hit a critical mass where a reaction took place, and it took off massively, and it's been the number 1 most listened to song on Spotify now for months. And this band came out of virtually nowhere.
Right.
So there's a different sort of process that follows a different sort of rules in the music business, and how the music business adapts to those new rules is going to answer your question.
Do you think that bands are taking more control and acting more almost like startups in that, the bands that succeed are those that understand sort of how to be in charge of their own destiny? Because it used to be that, if you're a band, basically your whole job was try to get noticed by somebody.
Right.
As opposed to taking control of distribution or control of marketing or control of your own audience and saying, hey guys, help me out, tweet that you're at my show, I mean, is there a difference in the kinds of bands that are being produced because of this new environment? There's
definitely a sense, this DIY notion, this indie sort of notion, that you can now be a master of your own destiny and you don't need a record label. And my friends at the record label is going to hate me for saying this, but I'm not actually sure why you would sign to a record label. Unless you're desperate for money, you're like on Skid Row and you've got a heroin problem and you desperately need that advance money, to cover your bill to Vinny the Fish. but if you're not in, if you're not in dire straits and you're a functional, person and you've got a day job, you can sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps now. There's a process for doing it, and you can later sign to a record label. And there are still benefits, because 49% of the music business is still, not the record business, is still CDs. So it's just now, I think in the last year, dropped below 50%. But that's still a lot. That's still close to half of of all of the music sold is on CD. So you need distribution in retail, you need distribution on Amazon, you need distribution in all of these foreign markets where your CDs are still being bought, and the only body that can really provide that is going to be a record label.
Let me ask you about Spotify specifically as it relates to you. You wrote a memo that was widely circulated to the CEO of Spotify, extolling the service for basically doing everything you wish you had been able to do at at Napster. Sorry for getting your startups mixed up there, at Napster. And obviously Napster, there's many wounds there from battling those record industry folks. And ultimately Napster didn't become what you wanted it to. Is Spotify Sean Parker's statement of getting it right?
Well, I don't think we're ever going to get it completely right. It's always, the world is changing so quickly that it's very hard to get anything right for long. Spotify is definitely emotionally and for me sort of an attempt to kind of finish what I started with Napster. I never gave up on this dream of a frictionless, free tier of service which would enable music sharing, in part because I believe that the traditional gatekeepers of music, whether it's the record labels or the radio stations or the program directors at radio stations or MTV or whatever, were not selecting the music that best met the needs of the public. Basically, the greatest music being made wasn't being heard by the greatest number of people. And that's kind of an ideological, it's a somewhat subjective viewpoint, but it's an ideological viewpoint, and I felt like the potential to disintermediate those gatekeepers was there, but you first had to create the right product experience, and then you had to go and take that and actually convince the record labels to undergo this change. And unfortunately, it took the outright collapse of the recorded music business as we know it to finally compel them to actually do deals. So the business went from a $48 billion yearly business globally to a $12 billion yearly business globally, and I think this year the numbers are down even more. That's a catastrophic failure.
Well, do you believe that, I kind of feel the same way about what I'm allowed to see on television. Is that what's next? So let's talk about airtime.
That's somebody else's problem to solve.
Well, okay, let's not talk about airtime.
TV is kind of in a golden age. There's a lot of great TV getting made.
There is absolutely, but is there a great interface to it, in your opinion?
It is really frustrating. It is really annoying. It's so annoying that these guys all even on-demand TV is so screwed up. And windowing is so screwed up.
I'm with you.
Anyway.
Well, maybe you can focus on fixing that for us at some point. That would be nice. Let's talk about the Facebook ecosystem. You obviously have very, deep and continuing history with Facebook. But I want to ask you, what's wrong with it? What don't you like?
It's all perfect. What are you talking about? Facebook's the greatest product ever created.
Facebook has taken the mantle, which seems to be passed every few years, of being the company that some people are scared of or feel is a little creepy because it might know too much about you and you're a little worried that it has too much power. Is this a concern that people should not have?
Well, as a Facebook shareholder, it's a little tricky for me to answer that question satisfactorily.
So I'm sensing you might have something you're holding back on that would say, yes, John, in fact, it is a little creepy.
Look, there's good creepy and there's bad creepy. And today's creepy is tomorrow's necessity. And anyway.
Okay, let me put it another way. You are an investor in many companies through your Founders Fund.
Yeah.
Facebook is a super important platform for almost every internet company that's either a startup or a large internet. We're about to talk to the CEO of eBay, and he has a Facebook executive joining his board. What do you wish you could get from the platform that you're not getting now as an investor in those companies? Is that a more sanitary way of putting it?
So, so for a long time, and I should try not to do product design in public, but I'll make an exception for you. For a long time, I've really wanted, better list management, the ability to. So there's essentially three things that happen when you become friends with someone on Facebook. You publicly assert your friendship. You subscribe to everything they're generating, all their content, and you basically start broadcasting content to them. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense in which those three things don't necessarily need to be part of one action. But the only way you can really separate them is if you move away from the idea of having an algorithmic feed where Facebook is deciding what information you see and what information you don't see. So, for a long time I've wanted the company to move in the direction of more tools, and they're not privacy tools. I don't think privacy is an issue. And I maybe that's controversial, but I don't think that that's Facebook's biggest problem. I think Facebook's biggest problem is actually just the glut of information that power users are overwhelmed with. And power users actually are very important in the network because they're propping the network up. It's the power users that are contributing tons of content which are being consumed by everyone else. So you take them out of the equation. Maybe the strategic threat to Facebook is that power users have gone to Twitter or power users have gone to Google+. But the way to address the need of power users is to give them more tools. They want to control what information they're seeing by basically organizing their friends into lists, and that should happen organically. You should never have to go to some separate management interface and categorize people one by one.
I've tried to use that, and
that's very tedious.
It doesn't work.
So what Facebook is, go ahead.
I just want to give you guys, there are mics here. A mic here, please. If you have questions for Sean, come up, because we only have about another 5 minutes or so. So I want to give you guys chances. So come up to the mics on either side, please.
So Facebook recently released a product called Smart Lists, which was lost in the shuffle, I think, with a lot of the other, the timeline changes and all the other product releases at F8. And, it's a step in the right direction. It's the first time that Facebook users have been given some degree of control over how to filter their experience. The next step is, once you've got your friend network organized into some sensible list, maybe it's just your close friends and your work friends and your family, that would probably suffice for most people, then you can actually start selectively broadcasting to those lists. But Facebook just hasn't taken that additional step. At which point, what happens when you become a friend starts to get divided up. So you can become friends with someone, but choose not to subscribe to their updates, and then you could filter them into a particular group, and you could direct all of your communications to only that group.
It seems like a lot of work. For example, if I'm listening to Spotify, which I do, and I have not integrated it with the Open Graph yet. And the main reason is because when the tune comes up that I might be embarrassed about, I don't really want ABBA being shot out to 5,000 of my closest friends. Nor do I want to stop what I'm doing in my workflow and tell it to not.
Right.
So and that's true for almost every action that one might take. You have to determine whether it's public or private, or in this circle or that circle or this.
Well, look, there's a balance that should be struck between kind of passive sharing and active sharing. I do think that sharing is about choice. Part of the reason that a video goes massively viral on the internet is that it's funny or it's entertaining, and you want to share it with your friends because you think they're going to laugh and you're going to look good. You're going to look smart or clever for having found that video and chosen to share it. So, the best content, this idea that the best content floats to the top only works, I think, when people are making deliberate decisions about what to share.
Right.
So, Facebook combines a lot of passive sharing with some active sharing. And, my opinion, again, I'm playing Monday morning quarterback here, is to would be more active sharing.
Mm-hmm. Let me, well, we just have a little bit of time, and then we'll get to your question. Ask you, since the late 90s when you had a company, Napster, to now, more than 10 years later, things seem to have changed in the financing market and the IPO market. It's incredibly robust, confusing, and sort of scarcely informed secondary market that is now blown up in the last few years. And then there's the IPO market, which causes people just an extraordinary amount of angst, the companies that are going through it. What's your view on how companies get financed and whether there might need to be some changes in some of the approaches?
In terms of early stage financing?
Well, both early and particularly we have this large set of companies who are either filed or about to file, but as with Mark and Zynga, it's really kind of frozen their ability to do normal course of business, and it is extremely expensive and time-consuming and worrisome.
Sure. I think that's been the case for since for decades, and I think obviously the regulatory stuff with Sarbanes-Oxley has made that a bit worse. But I mean, the process of going public has always been massively time-consuming. Having to make public disclosures of all of your plans and your earnings and everything it's hugely wasteful. This is why companies are choosing more and more to remain private. This is why Facebook has chosen to remain private as long as they have. The interest in Facebook has been enormous, and Facebook probably, if they'd wanted to, could have gone public earlier. It's obviously frustrating, but you have to get a return on investment to your investors at some point, and then it's just sort of a necessary evil.
And the secondary markets really have sprung up to give a number of those investors those returns.
Right. I mean, the secondary markets are a fascinating development. It's strange. The Forbes list came out recently, and they put all the Facebook, shareholders and founders on the Forbes list. And years ago, that never would have happened. The Forbes list would have waited for the IPO to take place, and then they would have listed everybody at that point because their shares had no liquidity. These days, the secondary markets are so robust that they're actually choosing to take the valuations set by the secondary markets as basically a bona fide representation of wealth.
Right.
That actually in some ways to me feels a bit premature.
Question here.
Yeah.
Ben Parr of Mashable. At the risk of you probably never speaking to me again, I have to ask this question, and I'll start by reading the first 3 sentences from your Wikipedia. Sean Parker is an American internet technology businessman and entrepreneur. He co-founded Plaxo and Causes and was part of Facebook. He was also a co-founder or early employee of Napster. Which one is it?
Wait, which one?
Are you a co-founder or are you an early employee? Are you a co-founder or not?
I was definitely technically a co-founder of Napster. I don't know. I have no idea. There's a variety of weird people on the internet who are always mangling.
I really like my Wikipedia page because I'm 3 years younger on it.
They're constantly mangling my Wikipedia. No, I mean this is there were 3 founders of the company who held founding stock at the time that we incorporated the company, and it was me, Sean Fanning, and a character by the name of John Fanning, who was Sean's uncle. And then everyone else from that point forward, I guess you would call an early employee. But I raised the first $50,000 the company used to get its servers up and running, and raised the first round of financing, which was one of these endless sort of seed rounds that never closed. And then moved the company out to California, hired the CEO, and so forth. So I was actually working on the product long before the company was incorporated. So if that doesn't qualify me, I don't know what does.
People just like playing with your Wikipedia then.
Endlessly.
Thanks.
Over here.
Mark Mahaney at Citi, you made a comment about Google Plus earlier. They seem to be doing relatively well. What do you think they're doing right, and what's the chance you think that 3-5 years from now Google Plus really significantly takes share away from Facebook? Under what circumstances would that happen?
Well, it's very tough to compete with network effects. And I think that, the way network effects work in a social networking context, in order to get the same value from Facebook, from a Facebook-like service, you'd first have to switch all your friends and you'd have to ensure that they actually switched. But then each of those people would have to switch their friends because networks are about interacting with your friends. So if all of their friends didn't also switch, then your friends would drift back to the original service. And likewise for the friends of the friends of the friends. So you have this exponential switching cost when a network is at scale. So I think it can happen. Obviously, it happened from MySpace to Facebook, but it requires systematic, consistent product execution over a long period of time, and I think it also requires the systematic failure on the part of the incumbent network. So Facebook would have to screw up royally, and Google would have to do something really smart.
Hi there, Jason Roy, not from any sort of media organization. I appreciate everything you've done, Sean. I was a college radio DJ back when Napster was around, and it was pretty important to me because I was able to share music actually with my parents and got them back into music and things like that. And I ran a show where a lot of very local bands, underground hip hop and stuff, we didn't have a way to actually get their CDs. We'd get them through Napster. They had no problem with it. Which brings me to why I actually don't use Spotify right now, which is because so many of the things I would like to listen to, I can't listen to. So there's a network effect there where my friends that listen to maybe smaller bands and local bands are unable to use it, or maybe even a band has an album on there that they haven't, licensed for that distribution. So how do you see that happening? How am I going to get to the point where I can upload something I've recorded and share it out on Spotify?
So, one of the big mistakes we made at Napster was obviously going completely peer-to-peer without ever talking to the record labels. And that gray content, which is what I think you're talking about, basically it's all of the live stuff and the little indie bands that aren't really signed that would just love their music to be heard. And alternate recordings of things, outtakes that aren't part of a recording artist deal with their record label. All that stuff I think is really important and it's fascinating. And that will come with time on Spotify. We had to start with the 4 major record label licensing deals and hundreds of different indie labels, and we've licensed music from just about every indie label under the sun. But that doesn't mean that we've enabled peer-to-peer sharing. We're just not at the point where we can do that yet. I think in the future it would be great if all that unclaimed content, the content that the record labels say, you know what, this is just not important to us, we're not monetizing this, we don't care about it, and by default, if it's not in our system, it's legal until we claim it. Otherwise, I think that's the sort of model that would enable what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I would like to keep going, but we have already run over time, so please join me in thanking Sean for stepping into the breach.
Thank you.
Sean, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Cool.